Imagine finding yourself deep in one of the most beautiful parks in Minnesota, surrounded by rolling bluffs and ancient trees. Now imagine waking up to whispers outside your RV, discovering barefoot footprints circling your campsite, and realizing you might not be alone. What would you do if you looked out into the darkness and saw a shadow that didn't belong? This isn't a made-up story. It happened to me, right here in Whitewater State Park. What started as a peaceful escape quickly turned into the most terrifying experience of my life. What was watching us from the trees? Why did the whispers keep calling my name? And what's the curse tied to these ancient burial mounds? Before we dive into this chilling true story, make sure to hit like, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more haunting tales. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. And let me know in the comments, have you ever experienced something you just couldn't explain? The air was crisp and clean, carrying the faint scent of pine as we rolled down the dirt road leading into Whitewater State Park. Emily sat in the passenger seat, her feet propped up on the dashboard, flipping through the park brochure with a kind of enthusiasm that made me wish I could relax. I gripped the steering wheel a little tighter than necessary, my eyes darting between the narrow path ahead and the dense trees that flanked us on both sides. "Did you know this park has burial mounds?" Emily asked, her voice brimming with curiosity. "Burial mounds?" I replied, glancing at her. "Yeah," she said, holding up the brochure. "It says here they're ancient Native American sites. Sacred ground. Pretty cool, right?" I shrugged. "Cool if you're into history. Personally, I'm just here for the views and some peace and quiet." Emily rolled her eyes. "Jake, you're such a buzzkill. These places have stories. Don't you want to uncover them?" I didn't respond. The road had started to narrow even more, the trees bending overhead to form a tunnel of green. The sunlight barely made it through the thick canopy, and the temperature seemed to drop the farther. We drove. Something about it felt different. Not the peaceful kind of solitude I'd been hoping for, but a silence that pressed against the RV, heavy and unnatural. When we finally reached our designated campsite, I pulled into the clearing and killed the engine. The forest around us was dense, the trees taller than I'd expected, their gnarled branches casting long shadows across the ground. Emily practically leapt out of the RV, her camera already in hand. "This is perfect," she said, spinning in a slow circle as she snapped photos of the towering oaks and maples. "It's like something out of a dream." "Yeah," I muttered, stepping out and stretching. "A dream, sure." Emily shot me a look. "Oh, come on, Jake. Lighten up. This is going to be fun." I wanted to agree with her, but something about the place didn't sit right with me. Maybe it was the eerie quiet, no birds chirping, no rustling leaves, just a stillness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Or maybe it was the shadows, the way they seemed to stretch longer than they should in the late afternoon light. Shaking off the unease, I started, unloading our gear while Emily wandered off to explore the edge of the clearing. By the time I'd set up the fire pit and unrolled our sleeping bags, she was back, her face flushed with excitement. "There's a stream just past those trees," she said, pointing. "And the burial mounds aren't far from here. We should check them out tomorrow." "Sure," I said, though my stomach churned at the thought. Something about those mounds didn't feel right. But Emily was stubborn, and I knew there was no talking her out of it. Little did I know, The burial mounds weren't the only thing waiting for us in these woods. After setting up camp, we decided to take a short walk and get a feel for the area. Emily was practically bouncing with excitement, her camera slung around her neck, ready to capture every angle of the forest. I, on the other hand, felt a growing unease I couldn't quite explain. The trees loomed tall and gnarled, their branches twisting in ways that looked unnatural against the fading light of the afternoon. "Isn't this place incredible?" Emily asked, snapping a photo of a particularly twisted oak tree. "Sure," I replied, keeping my eyes on the path ahead. "If you're into creepy vibes," she laughed. "You're such a wimp, Jake. It's just a forest." But it didn't feel like just a forest. The silence was what got to me most. Normally, you'd hear birds chirping or the rustling of squirrels in the underbrush, but here, there was nothing. Just the crunch of our boots on the dry leaves and the occasional creak of a branch overhead. We reached a small clearing where the sunlight broke through the canopy, casting long golden beams across the forest floor. Emily knelt down to photograph a patch of moss-covered rocks, her face lit with the kind of wonder I used to admire. "Look at this light," she said, her voice hushed. "It's perfect." I leaned against the tree, trying to relax, but my eyes kept drifting to the shadows at the edge of the clearing. They seemed to shift and dance, even though the air was still. "Hey, do you think those mounds are haunted?" Emily asked suddenly, glancing up at me. "Haunted?" I scoffed. "By what? History nerds?" She grinned. "No, seriously. Think about it. Burial mounds, sacred ground. That's prime ghost territory." I rolled my eyes. "You've been watching too many horror movies." "Maybe," she said, shrugging. "But wouldn't it be cool if we saw something? Like a shadow figure or an orb?" "Not particularly," I muttered, pushing off the tree. "Come on, let's head back before it gets dark." Emily groaned but followed me as we retraced our steps to the campsite. The forest seemed darker now, the light fading faster than I'd expected. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something, or someone following us. Back at camp, we built a fire and settled into our usual routine. Emily worked on editing her photos while I prepped dinner. A simple meal of canned chili and instant coffee. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the cool evening air, but it didn't chase away the lingering sense of unease. "Hey, Jake," Emily said after a while, her eyes still glued to her camera screen. "You ever think about what it would have been like to live here like 100 years ago?" I shook my head. "Not really. Why?" she shrugged. "I don't know. It's just, this place feels old, you know? Like it's seen things we can't even imagine." I didn't respond, but her words stuck with me as the fire died down and the shadows crept closer. That night, as we prepared to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't as alone as we thought. By the time the fire began to die down, the campsite was cloaked in shadows, and the forest seemed to come alive in the darkness. Emily had zipped herself into her tent after giving me a teasing, "Don't stay up too late, scaredy cat," and I was left alone by the smoldering embers. Normally I found peace in moments like this, just me, the woods, and the stars, but tonight felt different. The silence was oppressive, thicker than it had been during the day. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, but I couldn't pinpoint why. I tried to brush off the feeling, poking at the fire to stir the embers and sipping what was left of my coffee. The warmth of the cup did little to soothe the knot forming in my stomach. Every creak of a branch or shuffle of leaves made me glance toward the tree line, flashlight in hand. I told myself it was just the natural sounds of the forest, but the thought offered little comfort. Then I heard it. A faint whisper. At first I thought it was the wind. I looked up at the treetops, but they were perfectly still, not even a breeze disturbing their silhouettes against the night sky. The whisper came again, clearer this time, and I froze. It wasn't just one voice, it was multiple voices, soft and overlapping, like a distant conversation that I couldn't quite make out. "Emily?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. There was no response from her tent. I glanced toward the woods, my flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. The light caught on the trunks of the trees and the underbrush, but there was nothing there. The whispers stopped as suddenly as they had started, and for a moment, the silence was even worse. I stood, every nerve in my body on edge. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the clearing was almost completely dark. Something wasn't right. Then I saw them, footprints. Just beyond the firelight, pressed into the soft earth, were small, barefoot footprints. My stomach dropped as I crouched down to examine them. They weren't animal tracks. These were human, the toes and heels perfectly outlined. The trail of prints circled the campsite before disappearing into the woods. My heart pounded in my chest as I straightened up. I turned toward Emily's tent and called her name louder this time. "Emily, wake up! You need to see this." A muffled groan came from her tent, followed by the sound of her zipper. "What's wrong, Jake? It's the middle of the night." "Just come here," I insisted, my voice shaky. She shuffled out, her expression groggy, but when she saw the footprints, she froze. "Are those?" she whispered. "Footprints," I said, my voice tight. "Barefoot footprints. They weren't here earlier." Emily's face paled as she looked toward the woods, the shadows stretching farther than they had any right to. "There's no way someone's out here," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Neither of us said another word. We didn't need to. The footprints were impossible to explain, and the forest seemed darker than ever, as if it was waiting for us to make a move. We retreated to the RV for the rest of the night, locking the doors and sitting in silence. The whispers didn't return, but neither of us dared to sleep. Something was out there, but whatever it wasn't done with us. Yet. As the fire crackled low, and the eerie silence of the forest wrapped around us, something caught my eye. Barefoot prints, small and perfectly formed, circling our campsite. No one else should have been out here. Who or what left them? Emily stared at the tracks, her face pale. "Jake, this doesn't make sense," she whispered. Neither of us dared to speak louder. The oppressive stillness pressed in, broken only by the faintest sound, a whisper, barely audible, drifting from the woods. Was it the wind? Or were we being watched? What would you do if the forest itself seemed alive, its shadows closing in? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell to join us as we uncover the dark secrets of Whitewater State Park. You won't want to miss what's coming next. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the dense canopy, casting a muted glow over the campsite. The shadows that had seemed so alive the night before now lay still, unmoving, as if they'd been caught in the act. I stood outside the RV, a steaming cup of coffee in hand, trying to shake off the lingering unease from the night before. I had barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard faint whispers echoing in my head, a sound that refused to fade even as morning arrived. Emily, on the other hand, had finally passed out on the couch in the RV after abandoning her tent sometime around 3 in the morning. She stirred now, yawning as she stepped outside, bundled in her jacket. "Coffee?" I offered, holding out a mug. "Please," she muttered, taking it with both hands. "I feel like I didn't sleep at all." I raised an eyebrow. "You were out cold for a good 4 hours. Better than me." She gave me a weak smile but didn't reply. We sipped our coffee in silence, the forest eerily still around us. For a moment, it almost felt normal, just two friends camping in the woods, enjoying a peaceful morning. Then I noticed them. At first I thought it was just the uneven ground, but as I stepped closer the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Footprints. Barefoot. Small, impossibly small, as if left by a child. "Emily," I said, my voice tight. "Come here." "What is it?" she asked, walking over to where I stood. I pointed at the ground, and her eyes widened as she took in the prints. "Those weren't there yesterday," she whispered. "They're fresh," I replied, crouching to get a better look. The prints were perfectly formed, each toe and heel pressed into the soft earth in a way that suggested someone, or something, had walked here not long ago. Emily's gaze followed the trail, her face pale. "They circle the campsite," she said, her voice shaking. She was right. The prints formed a complete loop around our fire pit and tents before veering off into the woods, disappearing into the underbrush. "Do you think it's a kid?" she asked, her tone hesitant, as if she didn't want to say the words out loud. "In the middle of the night? Out here?" I replied, my voice sharper than I intended. "There's no way. There's no other campsite within miles." She hugged her arms around herself, her coffee forgotten. "Maybe it's just, I don't know, an animal." "Barefoot animals?" I shot back, standing up and brushing off my hands. Emily didn't respond, her eyes fixed on the woods where the trail of footprints disappeared. I could tell she wanted to dismiss it, to write it off as something ordinary, but the tension in her shoulders told me she felt the same unease I did. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The forest seemed to press in around us, the silence heavy and unnatural. "Let's just pack up and head out for the day," Emily said finally, breaking the silence. "Get away from here for a while." I nodded, relieved to have something to do. We spent the next hour gathering our gear, each of us moving in tense, focused silence. Emily slung her camera around her neck, as usual, but she didn't seem as eager as she had the day before. Her excitement had been replaced by a nervous energy that mirrored my own. As we set off down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest was alive with shadows, the sunlight barely piercing through the thick canopy. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made me flinch, my eyes darting toward the sound. Emily must have noticed my jumpiness because she glanced back at me with a small, forced smile. "You okay, Jake?" "Yeah," I said, though my voice didn't sound convincing even to me. She slowed her pace to walk beside me. "Look, I know it's creepy, but it's probably nothing. Weird stuff happens in the woods all the time, right?" "Sure," I muttered. "Weird stuff like barefoot kids wandering around in the middle of the night." Emily didn't respond. She just tightened her grip on her camera and kept walking. The trail wound deeper into the forest, the trees growing thicker and more twisted as we went. The silence returned, heavier than before, as if the forest itself was watching, waiting. I tried to focus on putting one foot in front of the other, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Something was out there. And whatever it was getting closer. The trail twisted deeper into the forest, the light dimming with every step. It wasn't just the trees casting shadows. The atmosphere itself felt darker, heavier, like we'd walked into a different world entirely. Emily kept stopping to snap photos, her usual enthusiasm dimmed, but not entirely gone. I envied her ability to distract herself. Every sound, every shift in the shadows had my nerves on edge. "Do you notice how quiet it is?" I asked, breaking the silence. Emily lowered her camera and listened. "Yeah," she said, frowning. "No birds, no wind. It's kind of eerie, actually." "That's not normal, is it?" She shrugged, though I could see the uncertainty in her eyes. "Sometimes forests get quiet. Maybe there's a storm coming or something." I didn't buy it. The weather had been perfect when we left camp, the sky clear and blue. This wasn't a storm. It was something else. We reached a small clearing where the sunlight managed to break through the canopy in scattered beams. Emily knelt to photograph the way the light filtered through the branches, but something else caught my attention. "Hey, what's that?" I asked, pointing to a cluster of trees at the edge of the clearing. She followed my gaze and froze. Hanging from one of the low branches was a bundle of sticks, crudely tied together with twine. At first glance, it looked like a child's craft project, but the longer I stared, the less innocent it seemed. The sticks were arranged in a vaguely humanoid shape, with long, spindly arms and legs that dangled in the breeze. "That's creepy," Emily said, standing and stepping closer to get a better look. "Don't touch it," I said quickly, my voice sharper than I intended. She glanced back at me, raising an eyebrow. "Relax, Jake. It's probably just something another camper left behind." I shook my head. "Why would someone make that? And why leave it here?" Emily didn't answer. Instead, she raised her camera and snapped a photo. The air in the clearing felt colder now, and the sunlight didn't seem as warm. I rubbed my arms, trying to shake the sudden chill. "Let's keep moving," I said, my voice tight. Emily hesitated, her eyes lingering on the stick figure, but eventually she nodded and followed me back onto the trail. As we walked, the silence grew heavier, broken only by the crunch of leaves underfoot. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. It wasn't just paranoia, I felt it. A presence just beyond the edge of the trail, always staying out of sight. I glanced over my shoulder for the 5th time in as many minutes, and Emily noticed. "Jake, what's your deal?" she asked, her tone a mix of concern and annoyance. "Something's not right," I said, keeping my voice low. She sighed. "We're in the woods. It's supposed to feel different out here. Isn't that the whole point?" I didn't respond. Instead, I stopped walking and turned toward the trees, my eyes scanning the shadows. "What are you looking for?" Emily asked, her voice softer now. "I don't know," I admitted. For a moment, neither of us moved. The forest seemed to press in around us, the shadows shifting in ways that made my skin crawl. Then I saw it, a flicker of movement just at the edge of my vision. "Did you see that?" I whispered. "See what?" Emily asked, her eyes darting to the spot I was staring at. There was something in the trees. Emily squinted but shook her head. I don't see anything. Probably just an ethan animal. I wanted to believe her, but deep down, I knew better. The movement had been too deliberate, too human. The trail began to climb, winding upward toward a ridge that overlooked the burial mounds. As we reached the top, the trees thinned out, and the mounds came into view. Small grassy hills scattered across the landscape, their shapes eerily symmetrical against the uneven terrain. Emily let out a low whistle. Wow, this is incredible. Incredible wasn't the word I would have used. The mounds exuded a strange energy, one that made the hairs on my arms stand up. They looked innocent enough, but standing there, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were intruding on something we shouldn't. Emily was already snapping photos, moving closer to the nearest mound. I stayed where I was, my feet rooted to the ground. Come on, Jake, she called, waving me over. Live a little. I hesitated before stepping closer, my chest tightening with every step. The air around the mounds felt heavier, almost suffocating. It was the same feeling I'd had at camp the night before, the sense that we weren't alone. As Emily crouched to adjust her camera settings, I scanned the tree line, half expecting to see the figure again. Nothing moved, but the feeling of being watched didn't fade. Jake, look at this shot, Emily said, holding up her camera. I glanced at the screen, barely registering the image. My focus was on the shadows, on the faint whispers I thought I could hear just beyond the edge of the clearing. The burial mounds were more than just ancient relics. They were alive and they were watching us. The sunlight filtering through the trees was softer now, muted, as though the forest itself was dimming the day. Emily moved ahead of me, her camera hanging from her neck, her eyes scanning the terrain like she was hunting treasure. I stayed a few steps behind, my focus not on the beauty of the place, but on the oppressive silence that wrapped around us like a shroud. The burial mounds loomed ahead, small grassy rises that might have seemed unremarkable if not for the strange energy they radiated. I couldn't explain it, but the air felt heavier here, colder, like we had crossed into a space where we didn't belong. Look at these, Emily said, pointing to the largest of the mounds. Aren't they incredible? Yeah, I replied, my voice hollow. She didn't seem to notice my unease. She was already crouching near the base of the mound, adjusting her camera to capture the sunlight hitting the grass just right. I stayed where I was, glancing back toward the trail. The forest seemed darker now, the trees twisting into unnatural shapes the farther I looked. Do you feel that? I asked, my voice low. Feel what? She replied without looking. Up. The air. It's heavy. Emily laughed softly, shaking her head. You're so dramatic, Jake. It's just a quiet day in the woods. But it wasn't just a quiet day. There was something else here, something that seemed to watch from the shadows. I rubbed my hands together, more out of nervousness than cold. Emily snapped a few more photos, then stood and dusted her hands off. I want to check out that one, she said, pointing to a smaller mound off to the side. I nodded, following her reluctantly. As we walked, I noticed something strange carved into the dirt near the edge of the mound, a series of angular symbols etched into the earth in a deliberate pattern. What's that? I asked, kneeling for a closer look. Emily leaned over my shoulder. Huh, looks like some kind of writing or, I don't know, runes. The symbols formed a spiral, each one sharp and distinct despite the wear of time. They didn't look like anything I'd ever seen before, and staring at them too long made my head feel fuzzy, like I was trying to focus on a moving target. Emily, of course, was thrilled. She grabbed her camera and snapped several photos, murmuring to herself about how unique the markings were. "We should probably leave that alone," I said, my voice tight. She smirked. "Relax. We're not touching it, just documenting it. This is a huge find, Jake. Think about how old this must be." I didn't reply. The longer I stared at the symbols, the more unsettled I felt. It was as if they were watching me, their sharp lines cutting into my thoughts. "Okay, got the shot," Emily said, stepping back and slinging her camera over her shoulder. "Let's move on." I didn't argue. I was all too eager to get away from the strange markings, though I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had made them wasn't far away. As we left the strange carvings behind, Emily's excitement didn't waver. She marched ahead with her camera swinging from her neck, her focus entirely on the scenery. I, on the other hand, couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The deeper we moved into the woods surrounding the burial mounds, the more oppressive the silence became. Emily stopped abruptly and turned back to me. "You're acting weird," she said, narrowing her eyes. "What's going on?" I hesitated, debating whether to voice what I was feeling. "I don't know. It's this place. It feels wrong, like we shouldn't be here." "Come on, Jake. We're in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nature. How can that feel wrong?" I opened my mouth to reply, but before I could, a movement caught my eye. I froze, staring into the shadows at the edge of the clearing. "What is it?" Emily asked, following my gaze. I think I saw someone," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Emily squinted into the darkness. "I don't see anything." There it was again, a flicker of movement just out of sight. A figure, tall and thin, slipped between the trees, moving unnaturally fast. My heart pounded as I grabbed Emily's arm. "There!" I said, pointing. But the figure was gone, swallowed by the forest. "Jake," Emily said, her tone halfway between amusement and concern, "you're freaking me out. Are you sure you're not imagining things?" "I know what I saw," I said, my voice firm. She sighed, her shoulders slumping. "Okay, fine, let's keep moving. Maybe you'll feel better once we're away from this area." I didn't argue, but as we walked, I kept glancing over my shoulder, certain that the shadowy figure was still following us. The trail wound through a dense thicket of trees before opening into another clearing, this one smaller and darker than the first. The mounds here were less distinct, their shapes blending into the uneven terrain. Emily knelt to take more photos, but I stayed near the edge of the clearing, my eyes scanning the shadows. That's when I heard it again, the faint, rhythmic whispering. It was different this time, clearer, as if the voices were just behind me. My skin prickled as I turned slowly, the blood draining from my face. A man was walking toward us. He wore a ranger's uniform, the fabric faded and worn. His hat was pulled low over his face, and his movements were deliberate, almost too smooth. "Can I help you?" Emily asked, her tone cautious. The man stopped a few feet away and tipped his hat. "You two shouldn't be here," he said, his voice deep and steady. "We didn't mean to trespass," Emily said quickly, standing and brushing dirt off her knees. "We thought these trails were open." "They are," the ranger replied, his gaze shifting to the largest mound. "But this place isn't safe." It's not just history, it's sacred. Emily frowned. Sacred how? The man's expression darkened. These mounds belong to the past, to something older than we understand. People come here and think they're just landmarks, but they don't leave the same, if they leave at all. His words sent a chill through me. Emily glanced at me, her enthusiasm visibly waning. What do you mean? She pressed. The ranger hesitated, his eyes darting toward the forest. The land doesn't like being disturbed. You've seen it, haven't you? The whispers, the shadows. It's trying to warn you. Emily and I exchanged a glance. I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could, the ranger continued. Leave. Before dark, he said, his tone suddenly urgent. And don't come back. With that, he turned and disappeared into the forest, his figure melting into the shadows like smoke. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The clearing was quiet again, the ranger's warning hanging in the air like a weight. Jake, Emily said finally, her voice trembling. Do you think he was serious? I nodded slowly. Yeah, I do. Emily looked down at her camera, her hands trembling. Maybe we should head back to camp. Good idea, I said, already stepping back toward the trail. As we made our way down the path, the whispers returned, faint and mocking. And this time, they didn't stop. The forest seemed darker on the way back, the trail winding through shadowed trees that felt taller and closer than they had before. Neither of us spoke much as we hurried down the path. Emily kept her camera clutched tightly in her hands, her earlier excitement completely drained. I led the way, my eyes darting to every movement in the underbrush, every flicker of light between the branches. The whispers didn't stop. They were faint but constant, like a distant chorus following us through the trees. Sometimes I thought I could make out words, but they were jumbled, overlapping in a way that made my head ache. Do you hear that? I asked, breaking the silence. Emily nodded, her voice tight. I thought it was just the wind, but it's not, is it? I shook my head. No, it's not. We quickened our pace, our footsteps crunching on the trail as the oppressive silence pressed in around us. The whispers seemed to grow louder, more insistent, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. About halfway back to camp, Emily stopped suddenly, her hand shooting out to grab my arm. Wait, she whispered. Do you see that? She pointed to a tree just off the trail. At first I didn't understand what she was looking at, but then I saw it. A symbol, crudely carved into the bark. It was similar to the ones we'd seen near the burial mounds, sharp and angular, with a spiral pattern radiating outward. Is it the same as before? Emily asked, her voice trembling. I stepped closer, examining the carving. It looks like it, I said. But why would it be here? We're miles from the mounds. Emily snapped a quick photo, her hands shaking. Maybe someone carved it recently. Or maybe it wasn't carved at all, I muttered under my breath. She glanced at me, her face pale. What's that supposed to mean? Before I could answer, a branch snapped somewhere behind us. We both spun around, the sound echoing unnaturally loud in the stillness. Who's there? I called, my voice cracking. The forest was silent. Jake, let's just go, Emily whispered, tugging on my sleeve. I nodded, not wanting to linger. We were nearly back to the clearing where our campsite was located when we saw her. At first, she was just a shadow among the trees, a tall, thin figure that seemed to flicker in and out of focus. My heart pounded as I stopped dead in my tracks, grabbing Emily's arm. "Do you see that?" I whispered. She nodded, her face pale. "Yeah, I see it." The figure stepped closer, and I could make out more details. She was impossibly thin, her body draped in tattered rags that hung from her like a second skin. Her hair was long and matted, obscuring most of her face, but I could see her eyes, dark and hollow, fixed on us with a stare that made my blood run cold. Neither of us moved, too paralyzed by fear to even breathe. The woman tilted her head, the motion sharp and unnatural, like a puppet on invisible strings. Then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she melted back into the shadows, disappearing without a sound. Emily grabbed my hand, her grip painfully tight. "We need to run," she said, her voice trembling. I didn't argue. We bolted down the trail, the whispers rising to a fever pitch around us. When we finally reached the campsite, we were both gasping for breath, our nerves shot. Emily collapsed onto one of the folding chairs, clutching her camera to her chest. "What the hell was that?" she asked, her voice shaking. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what we'd just seen. The forest was still now, the whispers gone, but the silence felt worse. It was the kind of silence that came before something happened, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever we'd encountered wasn't done with us yet.